doesn't look like my camera's on. Huh. Well, I'm not sure if everybody out there in the Facebook can see me. I cannot see myself, so that's not a good thing, but welcome to Orthodoxy Live. Our guest speaker this week is Father Aleksa Micic, who will be speaking on the topic From Tomb to Resurrection. And I'll go ahead and start our intro video and take a look at my camera and see why I am not showing up. Okay, so still my camera is not showing up. Let's see, FaceTime camera built in. Well, I think this week we might be going dark with me. Yep, okay. Sorry, everybody. So, good evening. I am a disembodied voice of Father Aleksa Micic, and welcome to Orthodoxy Live. It is a joy to have you here with us this evening. And I would like to welcome Father Aleksa from New York. I should say live from New York. So, Father Aleksa.
Good evening.
Well, let's try this one more time. It looks like I may have been muted just then. All sorts of technical difficulties this evening, but that's okay because we've got Father Aleksa Micic here with us, and it is a joy to have you once again here with us now that everybody can hear me, hopefully. So, once more, Father Aleksa holds a degree in cell biology from Wayne State University School of Medicine in Detroit, Michigan, and a Master's of Divinity from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. For 16 years, he ministered to the faithful community of St. Luke Serbian Orthodox Church in Potomac, Maryland, and recently he has served both the pro-cathedral parish of St. Sava in New York, as well as Holy Ascension Church in Elizabeth, New Jersey. In addition to his pastoral responsibilities, Father Aleksa is an associate professor of biology at Montgomery College. He has done previous research in neurocircuitry of brain centers in Parkinson's disease, neurotransmitters important in vision, industrial, pharmaceutical, and biomedical product filtration. That's a lot of big words. Father Aleksa currently leads and mentors student research in various physiological and mental health conditions. And Father, we are blessed and excited to hear a talk from you, From Tomb to Resurrection, a topic that in these trying times should offer comfort to all of us. So before he begins, I'd like to remind all of you that the goal of Orthodoxy Live is not only to present topics live, but to offer a forum for interaction and engagement. So please post your questions in the comments. I'll be monitoring those live throughout the talk. And if your question is on topic and appropriate, we will present it to Father Aleksa to answer. So that being said, Father Aleksa, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Father, and good evening to everybody out there. I'd like to discuss with you this evening, as Father very aptly put, the topic From Tomb to Resurrection. Really what it is a historical overview of various catastrophic events that took place through history to see how people recovered and got on with their lives. So throughout human history, we see many instances of suffering in various forms. These can be categorized in many different ways, including politically, socioeconomically, spiritually, physically, and culturally. We can also be sure that there have been and continue to be many instances of suffering that have not made it into the history books, headlines, or the public consciousness, but often are buried deep within the national, societal, or individual psyche. Usually we define suffering as torturous, causing great pain, inflicting great physical harm. Examples would be horrible diseases like cancer, the plague, or severe wounds, perhaps dying a slow and painful death. However, suffering takes many forms and is not always relegated to the most dramatic examples just listed, but is often very subtle and in need of someone or something to draw attention to it, lest it be ignored or forgotten. For instance, the person who suffers quietly through physical illness, injury, loneliness, or mental illness, being a few examples, without much moaning and groaning, is not seen at all to suffer, as opposed to others that make their pain and discomfort loud and clear. Regardless of these differences, suffering must be understood as something that tests the human soul, a trial by fire, perhaps, that many times brings out the best of human potential. A good place to start in examining this theme is the Old Testament. We find in the series of Old Testament books a wealth of examples in which human suffering of various forms is treated. Oftentimes, people uneducated or not exposed to the Christian faith and Christian ethos will pose a question, how can a good God allow so much suffering to exist? This is indeed a valid question, and one that deserves contemplation, but also research and study. For those that are interested in such study, an excellent book called Why Do We Suffer by Daniel Harrington offers a very good starting point as a concise guide into this very topic. In the Old Testament, we need only to look at a few examples to see a pattern. The history books and prophetic literature of the Old Testament woven together tell a story of the Jewish people who never seem to learn their lessons. Things are going great, society's flourishing, and then they seem to get too big for their britches, and God punishes them by allowing a foreign army to invade them and make them subservient. Notice I didn't say that God sends a foreign army to destroy them, as some might argue, but rather allows the excesses of the Jewish society to weaken them, and therefore be vulnerable to the fate that is in store for them. Only after a period of suffering, often portrayed as wandering in the wilderness or the desert, as it were, in their own geographical setting, do the people wise up and correct their ways. And this process is repeated over and over again throughout the Old Testament. The prophets warn the people, they don't heed the warnings, and in the end their fantasy world, which they themselves created, comes crashing down like a house of cards. Jesus Christ makes mention of this theme during his ministry to the Jewish people of the day, who surely knew their history very well, and it is recorded in the New Testament Gospels, where he refers to the weeping and gnashing of teeth, which perhaps we've heard many times. Other examples where we can learn plenty is the book of Psalms, written mostly by King David, where much of what he writes is from personal experience of his own sinfulness and error. We can also take much understanding from the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, together with the Psalms are known as the wisdom literature. In thinking about this presentation, I thought of several eras from human history where we can glean examples of suffering leading to redemption, or at the very least betterment or improvement. One such example that is familiar to most of us is the Battle of Kosovo. We know that there was a great battle, and that the result of this battle was decimation of the Serbian nation and the loss of freedom at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. Though this loss of freedom was finally realized about a generation after the battle is seen as a symbol of the suffering that was to come. This is beautifully depicted in the vast collection of Serbian epic poetry that arose from that difficult period. This poetry arose from the collective souls of the people over the course of several decades after the battle, and augmented later by the likes of Vuk Karadžić and others, not necessarily to commemorate the battle and the political crisis that ensued, but rather to document the suffering of the common folk in song, best expression of grief and pain that they knew. It lived on through the centuries into the modern age, memorialized by the Guslars of old and those modern interpreters who recently have begun to preserve this rich tradition for centuries to come. Not long after this period in Western Europe, following a difficult period of wars, famine, and disease, a movement developed that came to be known as the Renaissance. Most people understood this period as being centered in Florence during the reign of the Medici family and other areas of what we now know as modern Italy. But it was really throughout Europe that much of the creativity and innovation of man was displayed. Rising from the ruins of a weakened Europe, this movement of artisans, writers, musicians, and philosophers concentrated in several geographical centers of Europe over the course of a few centuries to not only offer the embellishments and comforts of art and music, but to change the way people think and go about their daily lives. While there's plenty to criticize about this period, it cannot be denied that it was a source of flourishing of understanding about the world, man's place in it, and a vision for the future, much of which is the foundation of the Western world. From this period rose socio-political concepts of freedom and human rights, especially lacking in the lower classes, that were the impetus for the foundation of the country in which we now live. The period between the two world wars was a most difficult time for most of the world, in which there was widespread poverty, illness, and violence. However, I'd like to concentrate a bit on the life in Serbian lands. Serbia had arguably paid a higher price from World War I than any other country in Europe as regards loss of life, especially young men, and to their treasury. It was during this period that God gave the nation a gift that would support the people not only then, but even to the present day. Bishop Nikolai Velimirovic needs no introduction, but there is one aspect of his ministry that often goes unnoticed and undocumented. In the mid to late 1800s, a few decades before this bishop was even born, a small disorganized movement of primarily scattered villagers organized haphazardly what became known later as the Bogomotiy Pokret, translated roughly as the movement of those who pray, or perhaps the movement of the pious. These people, known as Bokomolesi, are not to be confused with the Bogomils, who were a heretical group in previous centuries. The Bokomolesi gathered in villages, small towns, and fields and meadows to sing Christian songs, recite poetry, share experiences, to shed light on life as they knew it. Much like the epic poetry of the post-Battle of Kosovo era, their small groups were primarily interested in deciphering the meaning of their suffering. Only several decades later, against the advice of many bishops of the church, did Bishop Nikolai gather and organize these small groups into a force which aided the church in spreading the Christian gospel to the masses throughout the Balkan Peninsula. This strengthened the church not only for this obvious reason, but also helped the church to reform its own practices in many ways, mostly by being more accessible to the common people. This movement inspired many, not only in Serbia and Serbian lands, but also across borders in Greece, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Romania, Croatia, and as far away as Slovenia. Indeed, in a predominantly Roman Catholic country, there were known to be about 5,000 members of this group in Slovenia. Many of the participants remained in post-war Yugoslavia and continued in full force into the 1950s, despite the communist dictatorship there, and there are some who believe that the movement still exists in its raw form. Many others and their children emigrated to America and Western Europe after World War II and introduced this authentically Christian movement to those lands. Given the times, perhaps we'll see a revitalization of this movement, as there are signs of similar phenomena occurring rather organically. Almost 20 years ago, the United States witnessed its first act of war on its own soil since the Civil War. On September 11, 2001, life changed for the people of this country and many others across the world. I was living in New York at the time, and I remember very well how the tone changed in New York immediately after the incident and for a long time thereafter. For the first time in a long time, people were scared for their very existence. The streets and subways were silent. Nobody looked one another in the eyes. People were downcast. The Cold War and the Vietnam War and the decades preceding also caused anxiety, but those were distant threats. Over a few months, when the immediate threat of another attack subsided and people got on with their lives, it still wasn't the same. A few months later, I moved to Washington, D.C., the site of the Pentagon attack of 9/11, and found a similar sentiment among the citizenry there, one of uncertainty as regards terrorism. However, the nation managed to find strength to move forward and came together as one, perhaps the only time in my 50-year-old life. There was a sense of political unity, even among differing political parties, and people were united in a common cause against terrorism and violence. I heard the same things previously from friends who lived through terrorist bombings in their native Ireland and Lebanon during their childhoods. And while there were unfortunate reactions sometimes against the Arab populations in the US, for a little while it seemed the country found the resolve to unify. On May 1st, 2016, in the middle of the afternoon on Easter Sunday, St. Sava Cathedral in New York caught fire. I'm sure everybody remembers the images on TV and all over the internet of huge flames encompassing the massive cathedral. The home of the Serbian Orthodox population in New York was destroyed in an hour. Now, 4 years later, the St. Sava Cathedral community finds itself in the basement of a neighboring Greek church that was kind enough to offer their space. The reconstruction moves forward, but will take time. One might have expected the local community to disband and scatter, but it didn't happen. In the wake of the fire, even though some aspects of church life many parishioners used to count on are no longer, the faithful are still bonded together in a community of faithful in the basement hall of St. Eleftherios Greek Orthodox Church. We celebrate the liturgy, the faithful commune, hear the preaching of the gospel, and break bread together every Sunday and feast day. The community also comes together for special occasions and events like it used to, but it has adapted to the new reality, yet also anticipates the completion of reconstruction of the cathedral at some point in the future. Thanks to the generosity and love shown by the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of New York and the strong underlying faith and dedication of the local Serbian community throughout the New York metropolitan area, the cathedral will continue to serve the needs of the New York faithful long into the future. We must, of course, mention in our discussion the current events we face in our communities. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic across the world, the civil unrest in our cities, and the political discord that seems to have gotten worse, we're afraid to look at the news for fear of what might be next. We hear of a second wave, more lockdowns, a recession, a possible depression, riots, murders, job losses, possible Social Security cuts for the retirees, and other depressing realities looming on the horizon. All of these are added onto all of the other things we used to worry about before March 2020. In light of all these concerns, it seems impossible to focus on living virtuous and holy lives as God intended. However, we can be sure that we will pull through these difficult days as our ancestors and fellow citizens did in past crises. The common thread in all the scenarios outlined, and many others, is that people facing difficult and sometimes seemingly hopeless problems pulled through in the end by focusing on the Christian gospel. It offers hope to the hopeless, courage to the discouraged, comfort to the infirm, and strength to the weakened. In the British Isles of the Dark Ages, after witnessing their families and priests murdered and churches and civilizations destroyed by marauding Viking incursions, they humbly rebuilt and even succeeded in the generation following to even convert the invading pagan Vikings to the Christian faith. That was the beginning of Christianity in Scandinavia. The Serbian army of Prince Lazar in 1389 on Kosovo Polje knew what they were up against, yet they went to the church for Holy Communion because they knew that's where salvation was. Those in the Middle Ages whose towns and villages were decimated by multiple plagues gathered their strength to build new cathedrals, hospitals, institutions of learning, and other monuments to human perseverance and progress. The Bogomotiy and the Guslars taught their neighbors about hope in very dangerous and uncertain times. Throughout the Vietnam era, American families gathered around the dinner table every day to maintain the one thing they knew they could count on, the family. In the days of brutal slavery and Jim Crow laws in the 20th century, Black Americans kept on keeping on by singing most inspirational hymns in praise of God, their only hope of salvation. I would like to conclude by returning to the Old Testament for more instruction and inspiration. In the aforementioned wisdom literature, we hear in the Song of Songs the very intimate relationship between God and his people Israel, and understood in the Christian tradition and perspective as the relationship between God and his church, or the faithful. Likewise, the prophet Isaiah tells of the suffering servant, which is understood to be prophesying the coming Christ, the servant who suffered for the sins of the people. We look to Christ alone to relieve all forms of suffering, and if we hold fast to that described in the Song of Songs, we can be sure that we will not be forgotten. We find in the following quote found in both the book of Isaiah and the book of Matthew in the New Testament, that which sums up the lessons we can take from all calamities and catastrophes. He took up our infirmities and bore our weaknesses and diseases. Thank you, and God bless you.
Well, Father, thank you very much for the lecture. It was really wonderful, and I think something that hopefully can help many of us see that light of resurrection in this time of pandemic and uncertainty when we kind of feel like we're in a tomb. So the first question, what are some strategies that we, as we may find ourselves trapped at home or more isolated, what can we do to help keep us calm as we make it through these trying times?
Well, I would say first and foremost is to take stock of what we have as opposed to what we don't have, meaning the positives as opposed to the negatives. Another thing is we, of course, have to keep our Christian faith in the proper context because it gives us hope, it gives us strength, as opposed to weakness and doubt. Finally, I would say it's very important that we avoid the temptation of idleness, not doing anything, watching a lot of TV or whatever the case may be. We need to be busy to take our minds off of whatever it is that's disturbing us or causing us great angst, but to focus our minds on something positive, whether it be a hobby, whether it be reading a good book, whether it be joining together with your family, anything really, but something that has to keep the mind active and engaged, as opposed to falling into a certain lackadaisical way of life where, you know, it seems nothing matters anymore, and we just kind of take it as it comes.
All right, thank you, Father. We have a question from D. Hire, and she asks, are there Bokomolesi today? And if not, maybe why not, or what might have happened with them?
Well, there are, and I happen to know a couple who were part of the movement in their youth after the Second World War. However, those people are very few and far between. They're not active as they used to be because the groups really don't exist anymore. But I did interview a few people about this in years past, and they told me what their groups were like and how dynamic they were. And so the spirit of the Bogomotiy lives on, and I would hope that the people that were part of it would pass that down to their children and their grandchildren, and that it can be re-energized and reactivated. As I mentioned in the talk, I think that there are signs that that it may be there. It's just it hasn't been organized as such. And so, taking a quick look at a couple of books by Bishop Nicolai, especially the one called Divan, it's Divan. It is translated into English. For those that don't know the original Serbian, it gives a very strong account not only of what happened during those days, but also how the people accepted God, accepted prayer as part of their lives, and how they interacted with one another and their communities. There were many people that were against them, including within the church. But Bishop Nicolai took them under his wing and offered them his protection. And as they say, the rest is history.
Somebody asks, in this current time of pandemic, do you see any positive outgrowths? Have you been able to witness any maybe bright lights that we can look to as we work our way through these times of trouble?
I would say at this time, getting through it is a bright light because people have been relegated to their homes. They haven't been able to leave their homes in many cases. They haven't been able to go to work or to school or some of the other activities that they're used to doing. I know of statistics where there are many divorces, domestic violence occurring, and obviously that's not something we want to encourage. But at the same time, I think people need to just put it into perspective and understand that it will end at some point. If we look at it as something that's going to go on and on and on and interfere with our lives in the way that it has so far, then I would say that most people would lose hope. But I don't see it that way. It's going to take adjustment, yes, but at the same time, it will end. Just like all these examples that I offered in tonight's talk, they ended as well. And so what fruit will spring from it? I would say that it's the fruit of steadfastness of the people. Something maybe we've gotten away from. We've been weakened through the lives that we live in the society that we live in. And I think this particular pandemic and some of the other things that are happening may force us to center ourselves a bit more and to regain our faculties, to regain that strength, that inner strength that we always had, but maybe was weakened over time. Not to mention discipline as well.
Well, Father, I do believe that might be our last question. To all of you out there who joined us today, I do apologize for the technical difficulties as we tried to work through them. I did not want to disrupt the lecture or the question and answer by trying to resolve it, so hopefully before next week we will have a backup camera just in case we hit this issue again. But Father Aleksa, thank you so much for this lecture today. It was not only interesting, but I think for many of us, it will help us as we work on being steadfast in our faith as well. And to all of you out there who joined us, who asked questions, thank you, and God bless you. And if you stick around after our outro video, you should have a preview of next week's speaker, Father Stefan Joric. Thank you again, Father Aleksa.
Thank you for allowing me to talk to you.